At 65, Margaret Whitman enjoyed the peace of the home she had spent a lifetime building. But when her broken daughter and two rebellious grandchildren suddenly appeared, her sanctuary turned into a battlefield. She soon realized they brought more than just luggage. The gentle clink of a silver spoon against a porcelain teacup was the only sound that broke the silence of the October morning. Margaret Whitman sat by her favorite living room window, watching the early honey-colored sunbeams dance on the carefully trimmed lawn. Everything in this house had its place, from the stack of magazines neatly arranged on the coffee table to the plumped-up throw pillows set at just the right angle on the sofa. This was her world, a world built on order, routine, and a quiet satisfaction after retirement. Her garden, her pride, was showing off its late autumn splendor. Golden chrysanthemums blazed like little suns, and the old maple tree in the corner of the yard had begun to don its crimson robe. Richard, her late husband, had planted that maple on the day they bought this house, nearly 40 years ago. "It will grow with our family," he had said. Now she was the only one left, but the tree still stood, a sturdy reminder of a love that had once taken deep root. She was an independent and strong woman, but she still carried a quiet loneliness within her, an emptiness that not even the most perfect garden could fill. Margaret took a sip of tea, the chamomile flavor spreading gently. She had the whole day planned, gardening in the morning, finishing the novel she was in the middle of in the afternoon, and maybe calling a few old friends in the evening. A simple, predictable schedule, and it was all hers. She had worked hard her whole life, and this was her reward. Just then, the phone rang, tearing through the silence. The sound was so jarring that Margaret startled, spilling a little tea onto the saucer. She rarely received calls at this hour. She reached for the cordless phone on the table, looking at the display. Jessica! Her daughter's name appeared, and a complex feeling crept into Margaret's heart. She loved Jessica dearly, but her daughter's calls in recent years often came with a bit of tension, a request, or some complaint. She took a deep breath, trying to dispel the feeling of unease. "Hello?" she said, her voice calmer than she thought. "Mom?" Jessica's voice on the other end was trembling, broken. The suppressed sobs made Margaret's heart clench. "Mom?" "Jessica? What's wrong? Is something wrong with the kids?" "No, the kids, they're fine," Jessica sobbed. "It's me and Mark. Mom, it's over." Margaret was silent, her daughter's words slowly sinking in. Divorce. She had sensed it for a long time, from the way Jessica avoided talking about her husband, from the holidays they made excuses not to come home for. "I'm sorry to call so suddenly," Jessica continued, her voice still choked with emotion. "But I don't know where to go. Can we come stay with you for a while? Just for a few weeks, until I can find a new place." Margaret looked around her tidy living room, out at her peaceful garden. She pictured the three of them descending upon her, her heartbroken daughter, her sullen teenage grandson, and her difficult-to-read granddaughter. She pictured the chaos, the tearful conversations, the slamming doors. A part of her wanted to say no, to protect the peace she had worked so hard to achieve. But she couldn't. A mother's instinct overrode all reason. "Of course, darling," Margaret heard herself say, her voice gentler than she felt. "Come here. My home is your home." When she hung up, the tea was cold. Margaret no longer tasted the chamomile, only a vague aftertaste of anxiety. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. The sun was a little higher, but for her, the peaceful morning was over. A storm was coming, and her house was the eye of it. The storm didn't arrive in the form of rain and thunder, but as a scratched-up silver minivan that pulled into Margaret's yard late in the afternoon. The car looked tired and was so stuffed with belongings that it seemed to be breathing its last. Margaret stood at the door, trying to force a welcoming smile, but it froze on her face when the car door creaked open. Jessica was the first to get out, the dark circles under her eyes darker than her coat. She looked thin and exhausted, her once shining blonde hair now hastily tied up in a messy bun. Following her was a small invading army carrying their luggage. Leo, her 16-year-old grandson, emerged from the car with a permanent scowl. He was tall and lanky, dressed in a baggy hoodie, and his enormous over-ear headphones were already in place before his feet hit the ground. He muttered a "Hi, Grandma," without looking Margaret in the eye, his gaze already glued to his phone screen, and immediately began dragging the two largest suitcases, their wheels clattering rudely on the cobblestone path she and Richard had carefully laid one stone at a time. Maya, 14, was the last. She got out more gently, clutching a sketchbook and an old backpack. Maya had her mother's eyes, but they held not exhaustion, but a quiet observation, a wisdom beyond her years. "Hi, Grandma," she said, her voice small but clear, and it was the only sincere greeting Margaret received. "Come on in, kids," Margaret said, her voice a little lost. They flooded into the house like a torrent. Luggage was dropped in the middle of the living room. A coat was hastily thrown onto the armchair where Richard used to sit. The faint smell of fast food from their car seemed to invade the space, which was only used to the scent of cedarwood and chamomile. "Where's our room?" Leo asked, finally looking up from his phone, his voice impatient. "Upstairs, to the right," Margaret pointed. "Your mother's old room." Leo said nothing more, dragging his suitcases up the stairs, creating thudding sounds on each wooden step. Jessica sighed, rubbing her temples. "He's just being a teenager, Mom. Don't mind him." Margaret just nodded. She looked at her daughter, now standing in the middle of the chaos she had created, and felt a deep pang of sorrow. "Would you like some tea?" "Just water, please," Jessica replied, having already started to open a suitcase right in the middle of the floor, pulling out clothes and miscellaneous items. Less than 10 minutes later, another sound invaded the house. A thumping bass, vibrating in Margaret's chest, came from the room upstairs. Leo had established his territory. Margaret took a breath, trying to stay calm. She went up the stairs and knocked lightly on the closed door. "Leo," she called, "could you turn the music down a little?" The door opened a crack. Leo's scowling face looked out. "What?" he asked, as if she were interrupting something incredibly important. "The music is a little loud, dear. I have a bit of a headache." He rolled his eyes, a small gesture, but one full of contempt. "Yeah," he muttered, and slammed the door. The music decreased a little, just enough to no longer shake the walls, but it was still a foreign, harsh sound in her home. When Margaret turned to go back down, Jessica was standing there, leaning against the railing. "Oh, Mom, he's just a teenager. Just ignore him." Margaret said nothing. She went down to the kitchen to get water for Jessica and saw that the sink was already filled with cups, a pizza box, and crumpled napkins from their trip. The order she had so carefully maintained was shattering, piece by piece. She handed Jessica the glass of water, watching her daughter, who was now sitting on the floor surrounded by her belongings. This wasn't just a divorce. This was a collapse. And her house, her sanctuary, had become a refuge. But looking at the chaos before her, Margaret couldn't help but wonder, would it shelter them, or would it be destroyed by them? That night, after a silent dinner of takeout, Margaret sat alone in the living room, the lights from the Christmas tree twinkling on the familiar ornaments. From upstairs, Leo's music still throbbed. In the kitchen, the pile of dirty dishes remained. She felt like a guest in her own home, and she knew that the few weeks Jessica had mentioned would probably be the longest weeks of her life. The first few days passed like a silent whirlwind. Margaret's house, once a symphony of order, had now become a chaotic rock concert. The living room where she used to read was now occupied by a game console connected to the TV, with wires snaking across the floor. Empty chip bags and soda cans frequently appeared on her walnut coffee table. The kitchen sink seemed to have a permanent pile of dishes waiting to be washed. Margaret tried. She tried to suggest a dishwashing rota. Jessica just sighed. "Mom, nobody does that anymore. Don't be so stressed. I'll get to it later." But later never seemed to come. She also tried to set a no electronic devices at the dinner table rule and was met with a blank stare from Leo and a tired smile from Jessica. After 2 attempts, she gave up, silently eating her dinner to the sounds of video games and phone scrolling. But the chaos of daily life was just the tip of the iceberg. The real problem began on a Tuesday afternoon when Margaret's phone chimed with a credit card transaction notification. She opened it and frowned. A charge of over $800 from a high-end fashion store downtown. That evening, she found Jessica in the kitchen, making a cup of tea. "Jessica," Margaret began gently, "I saw a charge from the clothing store. Did you buy something for the kids?" Jessica didn't look at her, focusing on pouring the hot water. "Yes, the kids need some new things for school. You know, new school, new friends. They need to feel confident." "But $800, dear. Was it necessary to spend that much?" Jessica slammed the teacup down on the table, spilling some of the water. "You don't understand," she said, her voice a little sharp. "They've just been through a huge shock. Clothes aren't just clothes. They're confidence, a way for them not to feel different. I just want to do what's best for them." Jessica's words made Margaret feel both petty and out of touch. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she really didn't understand the pressures of the modern world. She said nothing more, just quietly wiped up the spilled tea. Things might have ended there if not for the phone call the next day. Margaret was in the garden, pruning the last of the roses, when she saw Jessica step out onto the back porch, phone in hand. She paced back and forth, looking agitated. Margaret intended to go inside, not wanting to intrude on her daughter's privacy, but then she heard Jessica's voice, a tense whisper she had never heard before. "I told you I don't have that kind of money. I've given you everything I have. No, it's not possible. You have to give me more time." Margaret froze behind the rose bush, her pruning shears still in hand. Just another week," Jessica pleaded, her voice almost breaking. "I promise, I'll have it. I'll figure something out." Just then, Jessica turned and saw Margaret standing there. She startled, her face changing color. I have to go," she said hastily into the phone and hung up. "Is everything all right, dear?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Oh, it's nothing, Mom," Jessica replied, forcing an unnatural smile. "Just old work stuff, a few loose ends to tie up." She hurried back inside, leaving Margaret alone with the words still echoing in the air. "I don't have that kind of money. You have to give me more time." Margaret looked at the house where her daughter and grandchildren were staying. The story of a divorce and a failing business was starting to have holes. The pieces no longer fit together. And for the first time, Margaret wondered if the real storm her daughter was running from wasn't a divorce. It was something else, bigger and much more dangerous. Margaret's suspicion grew with each passing day, like a poisonous weed creeping into her well-tended garden. Jessica, after that phone call, tried to be more cheerful, helping her clean the kitchen, asking about her day. But the effort was too forced, like a fresh coat of paint hastily applied to a crumbling wall. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she often startled whenever the phone rang. The real shock came on a Monday morning. Margaret was at her desk in the study, going through her monthly routine of checking bills and online bank statements. She had always been careful with her finances, a habit Richard had taught her. When she opened the credit card statement, she nearly dropped her teacup. The total spending for the month exceeded $15,000. She put on her glasses, rubbed her eyes, thinking she had misread, but the numbers were still there, cold and undeniable. She scrolled through the charges: a $2,000 designer handbag, a spa treatment for nearly $500, multiple online shopping sprees from expensive fashion websites, and a payment to Bayside Electronics for $4,000. She remembered Leo had just shown off a new gaming computer. Margaret's breathing became heavy. This wasn't a few essentials. This was a cruel extravagance, a blatant abuse of trust. Pain and anger churned within her, hot and bitter. She printed out the statement, the black numbers stark against the white paper, and placed it on the kitchen table, waiting. Jessica returned in the afternoon, carrying a small bag of groceries. She saw Margaret sitting at the table, and her expression immediately became wary. "We need to talk, Jessica," Margaret said, her voice frighteningly calm. She pushed the statement towards her daughter. Jessica glanced at it, and her face went pale. "Mom, Don't tell me you can explain," Margaret interrupted, her voice still even but full of weight. "Tell me the truth, the whole truth. $15,000. This isn't help. What is this?" Jessica collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Mom." "I don't need an apology," Margaret said, though her heart ached to see her daughter so broken. "I need the truth." Finally, through sobs, the story came out. But it wasn't the story Margaret was expecting. "It's not just the divorce," Jessica confessed. I tried to start a small business online, selling handmade crafts. I thought I could do it, stand on my own 2 feet. But it failed miserably, Mom. I borrowed money to start, and then I kept borrowing more to try and save it. I thought I could manage before Mark found out, but things just got out of control." She looked up at her mother, her eyes swollen and desperate. "I was going to tell you, I swear. I was just so ashamed. I didn't want to be a burden. That money, I used it to pay off a few creditors and to buy the kids a few things to cheer them up. I'm such a failure." Margaret listened, her heart torn between anger at being deceived and a mother's compassion. The story of a failed business, though painful, was at least understandable. It explained the stress, the secret phone calls. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" Margaret asked, her voice softening. "Because I didn't want to disappoint you," Jessica cried. "After Dad died, you've had to worry so much already." Margaret stood up, walked over, and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. The thin shoulder trembled beneath her hand. "Money can be dealt with," she said, "but lies can't. I'll help you, Jessica, but on one condition." Jessica looked up, a glimmer of hope in her tear-filled eyes. Anything. "You have to tell Mark the whole truth," Margaret said firmly. "And you have to face these creditors properly. No more hiding. I'll help you create a repayment plan, but you have to be the one to execute it." "Yes, I promise," Jessica said, nodding vigorously. "I'll tell him. I'll sort everything out. Thank you, Mom. Thank you." That evening, the house seemed quieter. Jessica seemed more relieved. Margaret, though still hurt, also felt a small sense of relief, thinking that the truth was finally out. But as she lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, a thought kept nagging at her. The phone call she had overheard. Jessica's voice had been full of fear, not just shame. Her promise was too quick, too easy. And the story of a failed business, it seemed plausible, but something still didn't add up. Margaret sat up. She no longer believed what her daughter said. A mother's love is infinite, but trust has its limits. She would keep her promise to help, but she would no longer be blind. She wouldn't wait for Jessica's promise. She would find out the truth for herself. Because to protect her family, she first had to know who the real enemy was. Jessica's promise seemed to bring a false peace to the house. She became more cooperative, cleaning up dishes, asking Margaret about the garden. But for Margaret, the silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was a concealment. Every time Jessica took a phone call and hurried outside, every time she startled when Margaret unexpectedly entered a room, the suspicion in Margaret's heart grew. She knew the story about the failed business was only part of the truth, like being shown a crack in the wall while the foundation itself was crumbling. Her opportunity came on a Thursday afternoon. Jessica said she had to go to the kids' school to complete some paperwork and would be late. After she left, Margaret went into her daughter's room, the room that had once been hers and Richard's. It was messy, with clothes strewn about, but what caught her attention was the laptop still open on the desk. A sense of guilt washed over Margaret. She had never invaded her children's privacy. But then she remembered the numbers on the statement, the fear in Jessica's voice on the phone. This was no longer about curiosity. It was about self-preservation. She sat down, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the trackpad. The screen lit up. Jessica hadn't locked it. The web browser history was a maze of desperation. There were no websites for craft suppliers or marketing strategies. Instead, there were names that sent a chill down her spine. Quick Cash 24/7, Bad Debt Solutions, Escape Debt Now. There were also links to forums where people shared horrific stories about high-interest loans and threats from creditors. And then she saw it, a tab still open, a flashy online casino website with glittering reels and promises of life-changing wins. The story about the failed business was a lie, a complete lie. Margaret slammed the laptop shut, the dry clack echoing in the silent room. She felt nauseous. Her daughter was lying, a dangerous lie. She walked out of the room feeling as if she had just left a crime scene. She went out into the garden, needing fresh air, needing something real to hold on to. Maya was sitting on the old swing under the maple tree, holding her sketchbook, but not drawing, just swinging listlessly. She looked small and lonely. "Hello, dear," Margaret said, sitting down on the bench opposite. Maya looked up, a sad smile touching her lips. "Hi, Grandma." "How's school, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, a safe question. "It's okay," Maya replied, looking down at her shoes again. Margaret decided to try a different approach. "Maya," she said gently, "I know things are very difficult for you and Leo right now. If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm always here." Maya was silent for a long time, only the creak of the swing breaking the silence. Then she whispered, "Grandma, Dad still calls Mom all the time." Margaret held her breath. "Oh?" "Yeah," Maya said, her voice still downcast. "He's not mad. He's just worried. I hear him keep asking, 'Have you told Mom yet? Have you told Mom yet?'" That sentence, in complete contradiction to Jessica's story, was the final piece Margaret needed. Mark wasn't an angry husband over a failed business. He was a worried husband waiting for his wife to tell a certain truth. That night, after the kids were asleep and Jessica was in the shower, Margaret did something she never thought she would do. She went into the study, closed the door, and dialed Mark's number. It rang 3 times. She was about to hang up when the other end answered. "Hello?" Mark's voice was tired and distant. "Mark, it's Margaret." Margaret," he stammered. "Is something wrong?" "I need you to tell me the truth," Margaret said directly, without beating around the bush. "The whole truth. Not about a business, about the real reason Jessica had to run." Another pause. This one longer. She could hear Mark take a deep breath. "Margaret, I can't." "Mark," Margaret interrupted, her voice firm but full of pain. "Maya told me you're not angry, just worried. She said you keep asking Jessica if she's told me yet. Tell me what, Mark? Is my daughter in danger?" Mark's sigh on the other end was like the sound of a dam breaking. And then the truth poured out, a murky and terrible flood. "It's not a business," he said, his voice breaking. It's gambling, online gambling. She started just for fun, and then it became a habit, and then it became a demon. She's lost so much, Margaret, more than you can imagine." Margaret closed her eyes, her hand gripping the edge of the desk. "She borrowed money," Mark continued, "from people you shouldn't borrow from. Not banks. They're threatening her, Margaret. That's why we had to leave. I thought if we stayed with you, they wouldn't dare do anything. I tried to help her, but I have nothing left. I told her she had to tell you, had to ask for your help, but she was too scared, too ashamed." Margaret couldn't speak. Everything was clear now. The phone calls, the extravagance, the fear in Jessica's eyes. It wasn't the shame of a failed entrepreneur. It was the terror of a hunted addict. She knew the enemy's name. It wasn't a debt, but a demon. And it was living right inside her house. The next day, the air in the house was thick, so heavy it was palpable. Margaret moved through her home like a ghost, her silence a louder accusation than any scream. She observed Jessica with a painful clarity. She saw her daughter scrolling through her phone, a fleeting smile on her face as she watched a funny video, and wondered how a person could contain both carelessness and terror at the same time. She saw Jessica's quick, wary glances in her direction. Jessica knew something was wrong. Margaret waited. She waited until Leo was at the library with a friend and Maya was out for a walk by the lake. She wanted this conversation to be just between the two of them, with no young ears to hear the harsh truths of adulthood. She found Jessica in the living room, folding a pile of clean laundry. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching her daughter perform such a normal task while her life was falling apart. "Jessica," she began, her voice devoid of any warmth, only the hardness of tempered steel. "I spoke to Mark." Jessica's hands froze mid-fold. She slowly looked up, her face drained of color. You You called him? I had to, Margaret replied, because the story you told me, it wasn't the truth. He's lying! Jessica jumped up, her voice shrill. He's trying to make me look bad. He's not lying, Margaret said, stepping into the room. I also saw your computer history. Online casinos, Jessica. Loan sharks. This isn't a failed business. This is an addiction. Each word landed like a hammer blow. Jessica's face shifted from shock to anger, then to a desperate defense. You went through my things? You spied on me? I searched for the truth, which you didn't give me, Margaret said, her voice still even. You made a fool of me, Jessica. You used my love, my home, my money to feed your lie. What do you know? Jessica screamed, her rage finally erupting, a rage fueled by shame and fear. Did you ever really trust me, or did you always think I'd fail? You're always so perfect with your perfect house, your perfect garden. You don't know what it's like to be imperfect. She paced the room, her gestures dramatic, as if trying to fill the room with her pain, to leave no space for the truth. Every time I stumbled, I saw your judgmental eyes. Even when Dad was alive, you were always the perfect one. You never made mistakes. I made one mistake, Margaret said, her voice breaking with the pain she had suppressed. My biggest mistake was loving you so much that I didn't see you were sinking. I wasn't tough enough. I didn't teach you how to face failure because I was always there to clean it up. This isn't cleaning up, Jessica yelled. This is control. You always want to control everything. That accusation, one Margaret had heard in various forms for years, finally pushed her to her limit. Enough, Jessica. Don't try to turn my help into my crime. You're in danger. Those people, the ones who lent you money, they're not your friends. They understand me better than you do, Jessica retorted bitterly. They understand my wallet, Margaret corrected. They understand your desperation, and they won't stop until they've taken everything. Jessica stood still, her face contorted by a chaotic mix of anger and pain. She looked at Margaret, and for a moment, her defensive wall crumbled, revealing a deep-seated vulnerability. But then it was quickly rebuilt, harder, colder than before. Fine, she said, her voice like ice. If you think I'm so terrible, then I won't stay here to be judged by you. I'll take the kids, and you'll never see us again. Maybe that's what you've always wanted, right? Perfect peace, without us to bother you. The final threat. The cruelest move, because Jessica knew it was the only thing that could truly hurt Margaret. Jessica turned, stormed out of the living room, and ran up the stairs. Margaret heard the bedroom door slam shut, a final, definitive sound. Margaret stood alone in the living room. The silence returned, but this time it was no longer empty. It was filled with venomous words, accusations, and the echoing slam of the door. She looked around her home, her sanctuary, now a desolate battlefield. Everything was still in its place, but nothing was the same. She had wanted to save her daughter from a demon, but in the end, it seemed she had only pushed her and her grandchildren further away, into the very darkness she was trying to dispel. Margaret sat motionless in the living room as darkness fell. She didn't turn on the lights. The faint glow from the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, like her own broken hopes. From upstairs, she could hear the muffled sounds, the scrape of a drawer, the rustle of clothes being stuffed into a suitcase. Jessica was carrying out her threat. She was about to leave. Despair enveloped Margaret. Where had she gone wrong? Was her silence for all those years a mistake? Or was her decision to speak up now the fatal error? The feeling of failure was heavy, cold. She had tried to preserve this house as a sanctuary, but now it was just an empty shell, about to be left behind. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Not a ring, but a sharp, insistent, and urgent knock. Margaret's heart pounded. Was it the creditors? Had they found Jessica? She stood up, her legs trembling, and went to the door. She looked through the peephole, and her heart seemed to stop. It was Mark. She hesitated for a second, then unbolted the door. Mark stood there, his face haggard and pale under the porch light. He no longer had his usual confidence, only a raw anxiety. "Margaret," he said, his voice urgent, "I'm sorry to come without calling, but I have to see Jessica." "She's upstairs," Margaret replied, her voice dry. "She's packing." "Packing?" Mark's expression grew even more frantic. "No, that's not possible. She can't go anywhere." Just then, Jessica appeared at the top of the stairs, dragging a large suitcase. She froze when she saw Mark. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice like ice. "Jessica, I got a message," Mark said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He held up his phone. "From one of those people. They said time is up. They said they know where we are. They mentioned the kids, Jess." The suitcase slipped from Jessica's hand, tumbling down several steps with a jarring crash. All her rigidity vanished, replaced by pure terror. "No," she whispered. Leo, drawn by the noise, opened his door and looked out. He was stunned to see both his parents there, with a tension he had never witnessed before. "What's going on?" Leo asked, his voice cracking. No one answered. Jessica slid down the steps and sat down, her head in her hands. Finally, the last defensive wall had crumbled. "It wasn't a business," she sobbed, the words tumbling out between breaths. "There was no business. It was gambling. Online gambling. I lost everything, Mark. And I borrowed money. A lot of money." Mark knelt beside her, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret saw him touch his ex-wife, a touch of comfort, not blame. "I know," he said softly. "I've known for a long time." "I owe them over $50,000, Jessica sobbed. "They said they would hurt the kids if I didn't pay." Leo stood as if turned to stone, his face ashen. Maya had also quietly appeared in the hallway, tears streaming down her cheeks. The whole family was now present, surrounded by the raw, ugly truth. All eyes turned to Margaret. For a moment, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The anger, the betrayal, the pain, it was all there. But looking at her daughter's desperate face, her ex-son-in-law's fear, and her grandchildren's confusion, another emotion rose. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was the protective instinct of a mother, a grandmother. She took a deep breath, her calmness the only anchor in the storm. "I'll help," she said, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "But not your way anymore, Jessica. My way." She looked directly at her daughter. "You're not going anywhere. You and the kids will stay here. Mark, you can stay in the living room tonight if you want. Tomorrow morning, we'll sort this out together." She turned to Jessica, her voice unwavering. "My conditions are these. I will pay off that debt one time only. In return, you will agree to go to therapy for your gambling addiction immediately. You will find a job, any job, to start supporting yourself. And for the next 2 years, I will be your financial manager. All your income, all your expenses will go through me. You will not have any credit cards." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You're not a child anymore, Jessica. It's time you learned to be an adult. This isn't a punishment. This is the only way back." Jessica looked up, her eyes filled with shame. But for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of relief. She nodded, a weak but decisive nod. The storm had passed, leaving a devastating but honest quiet. For the first time in years, they were no longer individuals with their own secrets, but a family facing a shared truth. And Margaret, standing in the middle of it all, knew that the road ahead would be incredibly difficult, but at least they would walk it together. That winter seemed to last forever, not just outside, but also within Margaret's house. The days after the climactic confrontation were filled with an awkward silence. The lies were gone, but forgiveness had not yet arrived. They lived together like strangers, bound by a shared tragedy, each walking their own path under the same roof. But then, just like spring, change came slowly, almost imperceptibly. First, there was Jessica. She kept her word. Margaret used a portion of her savings to pay off the creditors, a transaction handled through a lawyer to ensure absolute safety. Immediately after, Jessica began weekly therapy sessions. She also found a part-time job at a small bookstore in town. Every afternoon, she would return, tired but without the frantic look she had before. There was a new steadiness in her eyes, a steadiness built from facing the truth instead of running from it. The conversations between her and Margaret were initially brief, revolving around household chores. "Mom, what's for dinner tonight? Do you need me to do the laundry?" But gradually, they became more natural. One evening, Jessica asked for Margaret's recipe for roasted herb chicken, and they cooked together in the kitchen. Amidst the sounds of chopping and the aroma of garlic and rosemary, something was mended, though no one spoke of it. The biggest change, perhaps, was in Leo. He no longer slammed doors or blasted music at full volume. He still spent a lot of time in his room, but now he would occasionally come out, sit at the dining table, and do his homework. One Saturday afternoon, as Margaret was busy in the garden, trying to clear away the dead leaves from winter, Leo came out. He stood there for a while, his hands in his pockets, watching her work. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice still a bit shy. Margaret looked up, surprised. "That would be nice. Thank you. Could you help me gather these leaves into those bags?" Leo nodded and began to work. They worked in silence, with only the rustling of leaves. After about 10 minutes, Leo said, Mom seems better." "Yes, she does," Margaret replied. "Your mother is a strong person." "So are you," Leo mumbled, just loud enough for Margaret to almost not hear. She smiled, a truly warm smile. It was the most precious compliment she had received in months. Maya, with her sensitivity, seemed to be the glue that held everyone together. She often sat with Margaret in the study, each reading their own book, but her presence was a great comfort to Margaret. Mark also visited regularly on weekends, not as an ex-husband, but as a father. He helped the kids with their homework, fixed a leaky faucet, and always spoke to Margaret with a newfound respect. The house was no longer perfectly still, but it was also no longer chaotically noisy. It had a new rhythm, the rhythm of a family in the process of healing itself. It was like a workshop, with the sounds of sawing and hammering, with wood shavings scattered about, but it was the sound of creation, of rebuilding something that had been broken. Margaret realized that she had lost the absolute peace she once had. She could no longer read for hours on end without being disturbed. But when she looked out the window and saw Leo carefully tying up a broken rose branch, saw Jessica showing Maya how to bake, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had lost her quiet, but she had regained her family. And perhaps, she thought, that was a worthy exchange. Spring gave way to the warm, early days of summer. Margaret's garden burst with life in a riot of colors, and the old maple tree now wore a lush, dense canopy of green leaves. The house had changed too. It was no longer a museum of perfect order. Now there were always a pair of Leo's sneakers by the door, a few of Maya's open books on the coffee table, and the air was often filled with the scent of the new baking experiments Jessica was trying. The house was noisier, messier, but it was also more alive. Margaret had found a new rhythm in her life. She still had her quiet mornings with her tea and her garden, but now she no longer felt lonely. She enjoyed listening to Leo practicing the old guitar, the chords initially clumsy, but growing more confident each day. She smiled when she saw Maya's new drawings pinned to the refrigerator. Jessica had become a different person. Her job at the bookstore and her therapy sessions had given her a quiet confidence. She no longer hid her emotions behind harsh words or extravagance. She was learning to face the bad days and cherish the good ones. The debt was still there, a daily reminder, but it was no longer an haunting demon, but a responsibility she was gradually shouldering. One June evening, as the sun began to set, painting the lake in a brilliant orange gold, Margaret was sitting alone on the back porch swing. She closed her eyes, enjoying the gentle breeze that carried the scent of roses. "Mom?" Margaret opened her eyes. Jessica was standing at the door, holding 2 cups of tea. She smiled, a light, sincere smile. "I made chamomile. I thought you'd like it." "Thank you, dear," Margaret said, scooting over so Jessica could sit down. They sat side by side in silence for a long time, watching the sun slowly sink behind the distant trees. This silence was different. It was no longer awkward or tense. It was peaceful. "It's beautiful, isn't it, Mom?" Jessica whispered, as if afraid to break the moment. "Yes, it is," Margaret replied. "It always is." She looked at her daughter, the woman now sitting beside her, stronger, more honest. She had lost her absolute quiet. Her house was no longer a fortress of order. But as she breathed in the scent of the garden, heard Maya's soft laughter drifting from inside, and felt the warm presence of Jessica beside her, she knew she had gained something far more precious. She smiled, a smile no longer lonely. The house behind her was no longer an inviolable sanctuary. It had become a real home, with all its mess, its laughter, and its resilient strength.